Imagine if your teenage president wore a wedding dress, called himself a living god, and turned the White House into an orgy. That's exactly what happened in ancient Rome, and his name was Elagabalus. Picture this. You're standing in the searing shadow of the Palatine Hill in Rome. The year is 218 CE, and the Mediterranean sun glares down so fiercely that the marble facades of the imperial palaces burn white hot. But beneath all that pristine splendor, there's something festering, a scent rising that mixes the sickly sweetness of exotic perfumes with the copper tang of spilled wine and the darker musk of secrets so monstrous that even the gods might avert their eyes. Whispers crackle through the crowd like dry leaves in the wind. Words like transgender emperor, LGBTQ scandal. Rome's greatest orgy, and they carry the electric charge of fear and forbidden curiosity. Because behind those gilded palace doors comes the hypnotic sound of flutes and drums, not the solemn music of state rituals, but something wilder, primal, laced with erotic power. A rhythm that coils around your spine and beckons you closer to a truth so scandalous it's been buried under centuries of dust and lies. A young slave rushes past you gripping a golden chalice as though it's the only thing keeping him tethered to sanity. His eyes darting left and right, in a city trembling on the brink of either divine transformation or utter ruin. And you realize that all of Rome is holding its breath, because the boy emperor, who calls himself Elagabalus, has arrived, a 14-year-old Syrian high priest turned absolute ruler, claiming not only the throne of the Caesars, but the divine identity of a sun god, threatening to reshape the empire in ways that make even seasoned senators and hardened soldiers whisper words like blasphemy, madness, and the end of Rome as we know it. And if you think you've seen scandal in history, you haven't seen anything yet. Stay with me, because what comes next might change everything. You thought you knew about power, gender, and the dangerous price of trying to turn an empire into a playground. They called him Elagabalus. But that name wasn't even his own. It was the name of his god, a deity born of sunfire and black stone worshipped in distant Syria, with rites so exotic, so charged with sexuality and cosmic power, that even the iron-hearted Romans whispered the word abomination when they spoke of it. Yet, before he was a living scandal, before he became the ultimate symbol of Rome's forbidden desires and political chaos, he was Varius Avitus Bassianus, born around 204 CE in Emesa, what we now call Homs, Syria, a place where the boundaries between the sacred and the profane blurred into a single dazzling reality, and where the temple of Elagabalus, crowned by a mysterious black meteorite, dominated the skyline, like a cosmic jewel pulsing with chants, incense, and blood sacrifice. Its priests weaving a spell of passion and fear over the entire city. And from the moment he drew his first breath, young Varius was destined for something more than the dust and stone of provincial life. Because his mother, Julia Soemius, burned with an ambition so fierce it could have illuminated the lighthouse at Alexandria, determined to see her son claim not only a mortal throne, but perhaps the very cosmos itself. And as she plotted, whispering rumors that her beautiful androgynous child was in truth the secret son of Caracalla, the slain Roman emperor whose memory still pulsed like a fever through the legions, she ignited a chain of events that would catapult her son into the highest echelons of power, sparking a story soaked in sex scandal and the kind of viral drama that modern hashtags like Buying LGBTQ history, our ancient Rome, and forbidden emperors could scarcely contain, because this wasn't just the tale of a boy becoming emperor. It was the story of a civilization about to be bent around the desires of a teenager who believed he was not merely royal but divine, a living embodiment of the sun. And if you think political dynasties are ruthless today, wait until you hear how a single rumor from the Syrian desert was enough to fracture the mighty Roman Empire. And what follows next will show you just how dangerously thin the line was between religion, power, and pure spectacle in the empire that ruled the world. In Emesa, nothing was ever simply earthly, for this was a city where the skies themselves seemed closer, where gods walked among mortals draped in silk and gold, and where the temple of Elagabalus rose like a cosmic altar above the streets, its towering walls echoing with the chants of priests and the rhythmic cries of sacred prostitutes whose bodies were offered as living conduits to the divine. And it's here in this swirl of incense and sacrifice that the boy who would become Elagabalus learned that power wasn't merely political. It was celestial, erotic, and utterly intoxicating. Because in the East, unlike in Rome's marble forums and Stoic legalism, worship wasn't just about ritual and respect. It was about becoming the god, letting the deity consume your flesh and speak through your voice until the line between human and divine blurred into a shimmering fever dream. And for young Varius, growing up under the shadow of the black meteorite, said to have fallen from heaven, a sacred relic pulsing with cosmic significance, this lesson sank deep into his veins, shaping a worldview where gender identity and divinity were all fluid forces to be molded at will. And if you're thinking this sounds like the ultimate forbidden history or the perfect fuel for modern hashtags like ancient scandals and non-transgender emperor, you're absolutely right, because what Rome would one day label as perversion was, in a mesa, simply the way the universe worked. And it's precisely this sacred fusion of sex power and cosmic destiny that would soon collide with the iron traditions of the Roman Empire, setting the stage for a showdown so shocking, so drenched in opulence and taboo, that it would leave senators, soldiers, and gods themselves gasping for breath. And as we peel back the marble curtain of Rome, you'll see how one teenage high priest planned to bring his sun god and himself into the very heart of the empire. Julia Soaemias was no ordinary mother, for in the shifting sands of Roman politics, where loyalty was bought in blood and secrets, she was a woman who understood that power wasn't inherited. It was seized, manipulated, and sculpted like molten gold. And from the moment the dagger found Caracalla on that lonely road outside Carrhae, Julia saw opportunity gleaming amid the chaos. For she knew the Roman Empire was not held together by marble walls or legions of soldiers, but by stories, bloodlines, and the intoxicating myth of divine right. So she spun a narrative so audacious it would make modern hashtags like Nash, political scandal, royal bastards, and Nash secret heirs practically explode, claiming that her beautiful androgynous son was not merely the high priest of a foreign sun god, but the secret son of Caracalla himself, born of a forbidden union that bridged Roman imperial blood and the sacred mysteries of the East. And in a world where power often flowed from rumor as much as from steel, this single dangerous lie was enough to fracture the brittle loyalties of soldiers hungry for higher pay and yearning for a leader touched by destiny. And as Julia stood before the restless legions of Legio III Gallica, her son draped in purple robes and painted in the delicate cosmetics of a Syrian temple dancer, she invoked not only the memory of Caracalla, but the blazing promise of a new golden age, and the hardened veterans who'd endured endless campaigns beneath the sun-scorched skies of the East found themselves captivated, their swords and loyalty swinging like iron weather veins in a political storm, for whether it was genuine religious ecstasy, cynical ambition, or some collective madness that infects men when the scent of revolution hangs in the air, the result was the same. The soldiers knelt, hailing the boy as Caesar, hailing him as Elagabalus, and setting the empire on a path that would lead to unimaginable heights of decadence and depths of violence. And next, we'll witness how this declaration of a teenage god-emperor would send shockwaves hurtling toward Rome itself, toppling thrones and rewriting the boundaries of what an empire and a ruler could possibly be. Picture the dusty encampment of Legio III Gallica in the sweltering heat of May 218 CE, where soldiers grumbled over reduced pay, their loyalty to Emperor Macrinus, hanging by threads thinner than spider silk. And into this simmering cauldron of resentment strode Julia Soaemias and her son, the boy who would become Elagabalus, shimmering in imperial purple and adorned with delicate Syrian cosmetics, a vision so androgynous and mesmerizing that the battle-hardened veterans could barely decide whether they were witnessing a priest, a prince, or something entirely divine. And in a voice that carried the seductive weight of prophecy, Julia declared her son the true heir of Caracalla, igniting a collective gasp that swept through the ranks like wildfire, because in Rome's world of power, Game's bloodlines were the ultimate currency, and even the faintest whisper of imperial descent was enough to flip legions into revolution. So when young Varius, eyes smoldering with the kind of dangerous conviction that fuels both cults and coups, was proclaimed not only Caesar, but the living embodiment of the sun god, The soldiers fell to their knees, hailing him as Elagabalus, their shouts echoing into the desert night. And what followed was less a civil war, and more a tidal wave of belief, crashing into Macrinus, whose meticulous plots and careful rule crumbled like brittle parchment under the fervor of a teenage god-emperor. And as Macrinus's own troops began to defect, seduced by visions of divine favor and the promise of gold, the so-called emperor realized too late that he was fighting not just soldiers, but a wildfire of religious ecstasy and viral loyalty that no sword could cut through. And within days, his empire evaporated, his head dispatched as proof that the old order was dead, while the boy from Emesa stood poised to step into Rome itself. And as we follow Elagabalus on his audacious journey toward the heart of imperial power, prepare to see how this teenage sun god planned to transform not just Rome's politics, but its very soul. Imagine the caravan winding its way from the blazing sands of Syria across the glittering waves of the eastern Mediterranean, up the spine of the Italian peninsula, a moving spectacle so surreal that messengers raced ahead to warn Rome of what was coming, because this was no ordinary imperial procession. It was an otherworldly fusion of Roman legions marching in iron discipline beside Syrian priests clad in silk robes that shimmered like liquid sunlight. Imperial officials cloaked in purple, trailing behind painted courtesans and sacred prostitutes, whose laughter and perfume wafted on the breeze, and at the heart of it all rode Elagabalus himself, sometimes appearing every inch, the Roman emperor draped in a perfectly arranged toga, his face calm, statuesque like Augustus reborn. But then in the blink of an eye, he'd re-emerge in flowing Syrian garments adorned with sparkling jewels. His eyes ringed in dark kohl, moving with a dancer's sinuous grace, blurring the boundaries between masculine and feminine, human and divine, and every new town that witnessed this shimmering parade found itself swept into a trance of curiosity and whispered scandal, fueling viral conversations that would have trended endlessly in any age obsessed with forbidden royalty and celebrity spectacle. Because it wasn't merely his changing costumes that rattled the empire, it was the way Elagabalus shattered the protocols of imperial aloofness, plunging into crowds, touching common soldiers and performing ecstatic rites under open skies, leaving onlookers torn between awe and horror. And as this extraordinary procession edged ever closer to Rome, senators and citizens alike were left trembling at the thought of a new ruler whose very identity seemed crafted from both the sun's blazing fire and the seductive mysteries of the East. And next, we'll step into the city of Rome itself to see how this teenage sun god's arrival would send shockwaves through the marble corridors of power, shaking the empire to its very core. When Elagabalus finally entered Rome in the blazing summer of 219 CE, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. Crowds lining the streets with eyes wide as the golden chariot rolled through the gates, and beside the boy emperor sat an enormous black stone, the sacred meteorite of Elagabal, brought all the way from Syria like some cosmic talisman meant to eclipse Jupiter himself. And as citizens craned their necks to glimpse the teenage ruler, whose name had already become synonymous with scandal, they saw a figure who defied every expectation. A radiant, androgynous vision, sometimes clad in the imperial toga of a Roman Caesar, other times shimmering in jeweled Eastern robes, his face painted with delicate cosmetics that glowed under the fierce Mediterranean sun. And while some in the throng cheered, bewitched by this spectacle of divine royalty, others stood silent, gripped by a fear that this was not merely a new emperor, but the living embodiment of an invasion. For never before had the East come to Rome not as a conquered prize, but as a conqueror, bearing gods and customs so foreign that senators whispered words like perversion, sacrilege, and apocalypse, and within the marble halls of the Curia debates raged as the Senate struggled to decide whether to resist this teenage sun god or bend the knee in trembling submission, because every new report arriving from the roads told tales of dancing priests, erotic rites and ceremonies so drenched in ecstasy that the traditional Roman religion seemed pale and lifeless, by comparison sparking a wildfire of rumors that would have trended endlessly under tags like ancient scandal, transgender emperor, and forbidden history. And yet, beneath all the political calculations pulsed a darker unspoken fear that the boy emperor might truly be divine, that the gods had chosen to remake Rome in the image of the East. And as we step deeper into this story, We'll see how Elagabalus would wield his newfound power to shatter traditions and plunge the empire into a vortex of desire, chaos, and cosmic ambition. Almost the moment Elagabalus set foot in Rome, he made it clear that he hadn't come merely to wear the purple, but to transform the empire itself. For within days, the teenage sun god announced that he would marry his sacred black stone, the meteorite of Elagabal, to Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom and warfare, in a ceremony so unprecedented and so drenched in religious audacity that even the most jaded senators found themselves struck dumb, because this wasn't just some exotic curiosity from the East, it was an outright declaration of cosmic merger, as if the ancient gods of Syria and Rome were being forced into a union neither side had consented to, and the city rippled with gossip pouring from the marble steps of the Senate to the steamy back rooms of taverns where men and women whispered in tones that trembled between scandal and terror, and while traditional Romans clung desperately to their time-honored rites. Elagabalus ordered the construction of a new temple on the Palatine Hill, not to Jupiter or Mars, but to Elagabal himself, the sound of hammers and chisels echoing across the city, like the heartbeat of a new age, and in this dazzling sanctuary draped in silk and glittering with gold, the emperor performed rituals that merged the sacred and the profane rituals, so sensual, so charged with erotic frenzy that observers could barely decide whether they were witnessing worship or seduction, feeding viral obsessions that in any era would spark millions of views under tags like Ancient Rome, Scandal, Cross-Dressing Emperor, and Secrets of History. And as the emperor's wardrobe shifted from masculine armor to flowing gowns and pearl necklaces, he began to speak openly of marrying not just women, but men gods, and even abstract ideas challenging every law of nature Rome had ever held sacred and next. We'll explore how these relentless provocations ignited a storm of fear and fury among Rome's most powerful institutions, propelling the empire toward a reckoning that would decide whether the sun god's reign was a moment of divine revelation or pure anarchic madness. But for all the glittering pageantry and the ecstatic ceremonies that pulsed through Rome like an electric current, a darker tide was rising because while some citizens were dazzled by the teenage emperor who danced like a high priest and dressed like a goddess, many others felt a gnawing dread twisting in their guts, and behind the bronze doors of the Praetorian barracks, grim-faced soldiers whispered that the empire was teetering on the brink of sacrilege and collapse, muttering words like blasphemy, madness, and the wrath of the old gods. Because Elagabalus wasn't merely performing religious reforms, he was ripping out the very foundations of Roman identity, filling temples with Syrian priests, elevating beautiful young men to positions of sacred power, and presiding over rites so sensual and chaotic that veteran senators recoiled in disbelief, their voices quivering as they tried to debate whether the empire could survive being ruled by a figure who seemed less like Augustus and more like a living paradox. And on the streets, ordinary Roman shopkeepers, craftsmen, merchants struggled to explain to their children why the emperor, who gazed down from marble statues, sometimes wore silk gowns and pearls, why the music drifting from the palace sounded more like a fevered festival than the sober hymns of Jupiter, and why rumors surged like wildfire that the emperor desired to transform his body into that of a woman. A revelation that in today's world would fuel endless viral discussions under searches like Transgender history, LGBTQ emperor, and ancient scandals. And as resentment simmered, Rome became a city divided between those willing to adapt and those who saw every day under Elagabalus as a step closer to divine punishment. And next, we'll descend into the increasingly fragile corridors of power where senators, generals, and even members of the emperor's own family began plotting in hushed voices, convinced that the only way to save Rome might be to spill imperial blood. Inside the marble chambers of power, a dangerous quiet began to settle, as senators who once bowed in cautious deference to Elagabalus's shimmering presence now gathered in tight clusters, trading glances heavy with unspoken treason, because while the emperor still dazzled crowds with celestial rituals and silken gowns, the machinery of the Roman state was grinding to a halt under the weight of his excesses, his treasury hemorrhaging silver to fund ever more elaborate ceremonies and entertainments that mixed sacred frenzy with erotic spectacle, leaving administrators scrambling to keep the empire's borders defended and its grain ships arriving on time. And in whispered conversations behind embroidered curtains, the Praetorian Guard's officers confided their growing disgust, for these were men raised on visions of Roman masculine virtue, drilled to serve emperors who embodied military discipline and stoic gravitas, not a boy who spoke of marrying male courtiers, who donned pearls and silk and proclaimed himself the living vessel of a sun god, fueling a storm of rumors that would today blaze across trending searches like Rome's transgender emperor, ancient LGBTQ history, and the emperor who turned Rome into an orgy. And meanwhile, Julia Soaemias, the mother whose ambition had once blazed hot enough to set an empire aflame, now watched her son spiral into paranoia and cosmic delusions, his moods swinging wildly between ecstatic visions and dark suspicions that the gods themselves were plotting his downfall. And as the emperor began executing servants for imagined slights, then pardoning them moments later, those closest to him realized that the divine fire once burning in his eyes was flickering into something brittle and dangerous. And next we'll witness the final spiral as secret plots solidify into deadly action, propelling Rome toward a bloody climax that would decide whether the sun god's light would shine forever or be snuffed out by mortal hands. By the winter of 221 CE, the empire seemed to pulse with an anxious heartbeat as word spread through marble corridors and shadowy streets that the boy who had once commanded legions with the force of a living god was beginning to unravel from within. For while Elagabalus still draped himself in silk robes and summoned hypnotic music to swirl through his palace, his eyes now held a haunted gleam, and his voice, once clear and commanding, began to fracture into rambling monologues about cosmic conspiracies and divine betrayal, and those who dared to remain close whispered that the emperor who had once danced in sunlit ecstasy beneath the black meteorite of his god now prowled his chambers at night, speaking to shadows and hearing voices in languages unknown even to the most erudite priests, fueling whispers of demonic possession and a divine curse that would have trended endlessly today under searches like ancient Rome, mysteries, mental health of rulers, and downfall of a transgender emperor. And as rumors thickened like incense, Julia Soaemias found herself watching the glittering empire she had built begin to crumble in the trembling hands of the son she'd sacrificed everything to place upon the throne, his divine confidence eaten away by paranoia, his rituals growing more frantic, his proclamations more bizarre, until even the Syrian priests who had once called him the living sun began to edge away, exchanging wary glances as they realized they were standing too close to a collapsing star. And across the city, the Praetorian Guard shifted restlessly, swords rattling in scabbards, ready to decide that the only salvation for Rome lay in severing the mortal tie between man and God. And next, we'll stand in the echoing silence of the palace as the final conspiracy unfolds, bringing Elagabalus face to face with the brutal truth that even a god emperor cannot outrun the blades of mortal men. Within the palatial halls of Rome, under ceilings gilded with gold and frescoes depicting triumphant gods, a new kind of battle was unfolding. A war not of legions clashing on open fields, but of secret glances, whispered alliances, and deadly silence, because as Elagabalus spiraled deeper into paranoia, his once lavish court became a labyrinth of shifting loyalties, where every servant's bow and every senator's smile hid calculations of survival. And at the center of this silent storm stood Julia Mamaya, the emperor's formidable aunt, who, unlike Julia Soaemias, had always played the long game, watching with cold precision as the empire groaned under the weight of her nephew's cosmic ambitions and increasingly erratic decrees. And while Elagabalus devoted himself to building new temples, marrying men and gods, and dreaming of transforming his body into that of a woman, a notion that would dominate modern headlines under keywords like ancient transgender history, Rome's LGBTQ secrets, and forbidden emperors. Mamea was gathering allies, sowing seeds of discontent among the Praetorian Guard, whose patience had finally begun to fracture under the spectacle of an emperor who seemed to delight in trampling every Roman virtue And while public ceremonies still roared with drums and flutes and the gleam of golden vestments, behind-the-scenes meetings were held in shadowy corners where grim-faced commanders spoke of duty, of tradition, of the desperate need to restore Rome to sanity. And one name kept rising through the murmurs: Alexander Severus Mamaea's own son. A boy painted by conspirators as everything Elagabalus was not masculine, pious, stable, the hope of an empire drowning in chaos. And as these secret plots coalesced into a plan sharpened like a blade, the palace itself seemed to grow colder, as if the marble stones were bracing for blood. And next, we'll step into that fateful day when the Praetorian Guard would choose between loyalty to a living God or the salvation of Rome, with a decision that would echo through history in screams and silence alike. It happened in the hush of a morning that should have been like any other, as the sun spilled gold across the marble corridors of the imperial palace, casting long shadows over guards whose eyes darted with attention sharper than drawn swords, because Elagabalus, unaware that the fate of gods and emperors alike could pivot on a single heartbeat, arrived with his mother Julius Oemius for what was supposed to be a routine meeting with the Praetorian commanders. But as they stepped into the chamber, the scent of oil and cold steel hung thick in the air, and the boy who had once commanded armies with a gaze blazing like the sun suddenly saw only faces set like stone eyes that refused to kneel. And the hush before violence was so deep it seemed to stretch into eternity, until the first blade flashed and screams ripped the silence apart. And in that instant, the empire that had once seemed remade in Elagabalus's image collapsed around him, as soldiers who had once hailed him as the living sun god now dragged him and his mother down in a frenzy of blood and vengeance, their purple robes soaked in crimson as they struggled, pleaded, and finally fell under the relentless thrust of imperial daggers, and no divine power came to save him. No cosmic miracle split the ceiling to prove his divinity, for in Rome even gods could bleed. And when it was over, their bodies were stripped, mutilated, and dragged through the streets, spat upon, and hurled into the Tiber, a brutal public purge meant to erase not just a boy emperor, but every forbidden idea he represented. And as the river swallowed their remains, a new emperor waited in the wings, and next we'll see how Alexander Severus stepped forward to claim a throne cleansed by violence, and whether Rome could ever truly bury the ghost of the sun, God who dared to change everything. And so, as the blood of the sun, God still glistened on marble floors, and the river carried away the remnants of a rain that had burned too bright and too wild. Rome turned its weary eyes to Alexander Severus, a boy barely 13 years old, yet hailed as the empire's salvation, for where Elagabalus had draped himself in silk and pearls, Alexander wore the sober tunic of Roman tradition, his youth carefully crafted into an image of calm masculinity and measured authority. And in the days following the assassination, the Senate scrambled to wipe clean the slate of history, converting the grand temple of Elagabal on the Palatine Hill into new shrines for more acceptable gods, dismissing or executing the Syrian priests who once danced in swirling incense, and ordering the sacred black meteorite, the very heart of Elagabalus's cosmic revolution, shipped discreetly back to Syria, as if by removing the stone. They could scrub away the memory of the emperor who dared to blur the lines between man and woman, mortal and divine, because to the Roman elite, the 4 years of Elagabalus's rule stood as a terrifying glimpse of a world without boundaries, a world where the old certainties of gender, religion, and power crumbled beneath the feet of a teenager who believed he could remake Rome in his own radiant, scandalous image. And yet, for all their efforts to erase him, the story of Elagabalus refused to die, whispering through history as a forbidden echo, fueling modern fascinations and viral searches, like transgender history, ancient LGBTQ rulers, and Rome's greatest scandals for people, could not help but wonder whether he was a monster driven by depravity or a visionary, centuries ahead of his time. And next, we'll look deeper into how his brief blazing reign left scars on Rome's psyche that would never truly heal, raising questions about identity, freedom, and the high price of daring to live as your truest self. Yet even as Alexander Severus's reign restored a fragile semblance of order, and Rome's marble facades once again gleamed with the austere dignity of tradition, the shadow of Elagabalus lingered like a whispered secret woven into the city's stones, because despite every senator's effort to strike his name from inscriptions and every priest's prayer to purify the temples, the 4 years of the teenage son God had cracked something open in the Roman soul, revealing a truth both terrifying and tantalizing, that the lines Rome so carefully drew between male and female mortal and divine ruler and ruled were far thinner than anyone dared admit. And while conservative historians painted Elagabalus as a monster of depravity, as a cautionary tale of decadence gone mad, others both then and now couldn't help but see in his wild reign the glimmer of something revolutionary, a fleeting vision of a world where identity wasn't chained by birth or gender, where gods could be as fluid as the shifting desert sands. And in modern times, his name has become an irresistible spark for viral fascination, fueling endless documentaries, YouTube deep dives and searches for terms like ancient transgender emperor, LGBTQ history, and Rome's forbidden scandals, because Elagabalus forces us to ask whether he was a tragic villain or a prophet of freedom, whether he shattered Rome or simply held up a mirror to a society whose own contradictions were already fracturing beneath the surface. And even today, as we stand in a digital age obsessed with influencers, identity, and spectacle, the story of the boy who dared to dance on the throne of the Caesars remains an explosive reminder that sometimes the most dangerous force in history is the courage to live your truth. And as we reach the final turn in this saga, we'll explore how the echoes of Elagabalus continue to challenge and haunt us, inviting us to reconsider what power, identity, and transformation truly mean across centuries. Because in the end, the story of Elagabalus is not merely the tale of a boy who seized the Roman throne and turned it into his personal stage for cosmic drama, but a mirror held up to every society, past or present, daring us to confront the limits we impose on identity, desire, and power. For while the senators called him a monster and the historians branded him as a cautionary tale, the whispers that echo through the centuries refuse to be silenced, reminding us that he was also a symbol of boundless transformation, a spark of possibility that burned so brightly it threatened to ignite the entire empire. And perhaps that's why his legacy pulses so vibrantly today, in the digital veins of the internet, driving viral obsessions, trending topics, and YouTube rabbit holes under searches like ancient transgender rulers, forbidden emperors, and Rome's LGBTQ secrets. Because whether you see Elagabalus as a tragic lunatic consumed by his own fantasies, or as a visionary who glimpsed a future world of fluid identities and personal freedom, his reign stands as one of history's most explosive what-ifs, an era when a teenage high priest tried to bend the laws of gods and men alike to his will. And though his body was dumped into the Tiber and his name scrubbed from the marble records, the questions he forced into the open have never truly gone away, lingering like embers waiting to catch fire, because even in our own time, we still wrestle with the same tensions he embodied. Who gets to define normal? Who holds the power to shape identity? And what price must be paid for daring to live outside the boundaries drawn by tradition? And as we close this journey through the life and death of Rome's most scandalous emperor, remember that sometimes the figures who burn too bright for their own world are the ones who leave behind the longest shadows. And in just a moment, I'll tell you why Elagabalus might be more relevant today than ever before. Because even centuries later, in an age of hashtags, viral videos, and global conversations about gender power and identity, the name Elagabalus still sends a shockwave through our collective imagination, refusing to lie quietly in the dust of forgotten emperors. For he was not simply a ruler draped in pearls and silk, but a living paradox, a teenage high priest who believed he could merge flesh and divinity, male and female, east and west, in a single incandescent vision. And it's precisely this defiance of boundaries that makes his story resonate so fiercely today, fueling countless documentaries, academic debates, and endless YouTube deep dives under searches like ancient transgender history, Rome's biggest scandals, and forbidden emperors, because Elagabalus forces us to ask questions that still burn at the heart of modern society. What happens when personal truth collides with public expectation, when someone dares to rewrite the rules of gender, sexuality, and religion on the grandest stage imaginable? And was he truly mad or merely centuries ahead of his time? A figure whose cosmic dreams threatened the very foundations of an empire built on rigid traditions. And even though his reign ended in blood, his body tossed like refuse into the Tiber, the echoes of his life continue to ripple outward, challenging us to imagine a world where identity is not dictated by birth, but chosen with divine audacity. And perhaps that's why in the age of viral storytelling his tale grips us tighter than ever, because buried within the scandal and spectacle lies a timeless human truth that the price of transformation is often paid in blood, but the legacy it leaves behind can inspire generations yet unborn. And as we draw this story to its close, stay with me, because in the final moments, I'll reveal why Elagabalus might be the emperor whose story was not just erased from history, but written for the future. Standing once more beneath the ghostly shadows of the Palatine Hill, you can almost hear the distant echo of drums and flutes that once pulsed through Rome's marble avenues. And though the golden chariot of Elagabalus has long vanished, replaced by the sober processions of emperors more palatable to history's guardians, the questions he raised blaze as fiercely as ever, because his story was never simply about scandal or sexual curiosity, but about power. The raw, breathtaking power to define yourself, to claim an identity beyond the limits imposed by empire tradition or fear. And it's that spark of cosmic rebellion that makes his legacy impossible to bury. Fueling modern obsessions and viral content across platforms under searches like Ancient Transgender Emperor Rome's Forbidden Rulers and LGBTQ history, for whether you believe Elagabalus was a monster driven by unchecked hedonism or a visionary who glimpsed truths the world wasn't ready to accept. He stands as one of history's most explosive reminders that the boundaries we draw around gender divinity and political authority are far more fragile than we like to admit. And even today, in a world grappling with fierce debates over identity, personal freedom, and who gets to decide the shape of public morality, his name slips like a spark into conversations about authenticity and the cost of living one's truth, reminding us that the price of transformation can be both brutal and transcendent, and that the figures we label as heretics or abominations are often the same ones who force societies to grow. And as we step into the final moments of this saga, stay with me, because I'm about to reveal why the Forbidden Emperor from Syria might just be the ultimate cautionary tale and the ultimate inspiration for our age of viral truth and digital immortality. Because the true reason Elagabalus refuses to fade into the silent pages of dusty scrolls is that his story isn't trapped in the past. It's a living current that surges straight into our present, demanding we confront the same questions that once terrified senators and thrilled scandal-hungry crowds. For in a world obsessed with identity, authenticity, and the performance of self across endless digital stages, the vision of a teenage emperor who dared to fuse godhood with gender fluidity, who turned an empire's most sacred traditions into his personal theater, speaks with a relevance that's impossible to ignore, sparking viral fascination and fierce debate under searches like ancient LGBTQ icons, forbidden Roman emperors, and the emperor who turned Rome into an orgy. Because Elagabalus forces us to ask whether the structures we call normal, our laws, our moral codes, even the stories we tell about history, are genuinely eternal truths or merely fragile constructs trembling before the audacity of a single soul who insists on living his truth no matter the cost. And in a time where influencers command millions with curated identities, where public and private selves collide on screens viewed around the world, his life feels like a cautionary tale and an invitation, all at once reminding us that the power to define reality is intoxicating, but perilous, and that those who try to remake the world often pay for it with blood, yet leave behind sparks that continue to ignite imaginations centuries later. And as we turn now toward the closing words of this saga, stay with me, because in just a moment I'll share why Elagabalus may not simply be history's most scandalous emperor, but one of its most hauntingly prophetic voices echoing into our own uncertain future. Because when you strip away the blood-soaked marble floors, the whispered conspiracies, and the gleaming jewels that caught the torchlight in Rome's shadowy corridors, what remains at the core of Elagabalus's story is something profoundly human, a raw, burning need to be seen, to be accepted not just as a ruler or a priest, but as a person whose identity refused to fit the molds an empire tried to impose. And it's precisely this spark of defiance that keeps his tale alive today, pulsing through modern documentaries, viral TikToks, and endless YouTube essays that dive into keywords like ancient LGBTQ history, transgender emperors, and forbidden rulers of Rome, because Elagabalus doesn't merely haunt us as a scandalous footnote in imperial chronicles. He forces us to reckon with the limits of tradition, with how societies decide who is allowed to exist in public view, and how violently they react when someone dares to step beyond the boundaries they've drawn. And while his reign ended in murder and his body was hurled into the Tiber like refuse, his name remains etched into the digital memory of an age that both fears and craves the kind of radical self-reinvention he embodied, reminding us that even when history tries to silence certain voices, those stories inevitably find their way back into the light, more magnetic and dangerous than ever. And as we approach the close of this saga, stay with me, because in a moment, I'll leave you with a question that lies at the very heart of Elagabalus's legend, a question that might just make you wonder how much of the sun, God's fire, still burns within our own world, waiting to explode into something utterly new. Because perhaps the most haunting truth lurking behind the glitter and blood of Elagabalus's story is that we, centuries later, remain as fascinated and as divided as the Romans, who once watched his golden chariot roll through their city gates. For he stands as an emperor who dared to live in defiance of every boundary. Society tried to draw around him, weaving together cosmic religion, gender transformation, and personal spectacle into a single blazing vision that still ripples through our culture today, surfacing in viral documentaries, heated comment sections, and trending searches for terms like ancient transgender ruler, Rome's forbidden emperors, and LGBTQ secrets of history, because Elagabalus forces us to face the uncomfortable reality that power and identity are always intertwined, that the right to define oneself has always been the ultimate act of rebellion, and that the price for daring to shatter norms can be as high as a river running red with imperial blood. And as we peer back through the centuries, it's impossible not to wonder whether we've truly progressed beyond the same primal fears and fascinations that led Rome to slaughter a teenage emperor whose only true crime may have been believing that he could reshape the world in the image of his own blazing inner sun. And maybe that's why his name still pulses in the digital veins of our modern world, refusing to die. Because deep down we sense that the story of Elagabalus is not just a tale of ancient scandal, but a mirror reflecting questions we still haven't answered. And as we turn now to the final words of this saga, stay with me, because in one last breath, I'll ask you the question that may linger in your mind long after this video fades, a question about who we really are and who we dare to become. So I leave you now with a question echoing through the marble corridors of history. The same question that once kept senators awake at night and sent tremors through the iron ranks of the Praetorian Guard. Was Elagabalus truly a monster who drenched Rome in scandal and sacrilege? Or was he a blazing visionary who dared to glimpse a future world where identity could flow as freely as sunlight, and where the divine might be found in the courage to live one's truth? For in a time when we measure fame in viral views and brand ourselves across endless digital feeds, the story of this teenage emperor burns more vividly than ever, sparking viral fascination and fierce debate under searches like Rome's transgender emperor, forbidden rulers of antiquity, and the secrets of ancient LGBTQ history, because deep down we still wrestle with the same shadows that haunted Rome. Fear of the other, fear of transformation, fear that the world we've built might collapse if someone dares to be different enough. And while his body was hurled into the Tiber and his temples raised the questions Elagabalus forced into the light, refuse to die, pulsing through our modern culture like a secret rhythm, daring us to ask ourselves whether we would have stood cheering in the streets as his golden chariot rolled past, or joined the conspirators, sharpening their blades in silence. And perhaps that is his true legacy, not merely the scandal of silk robes and sacred stones, but the uncomfortable truth that the human soul will always hunger to break its chains, to transform, to become something new. And as we approach the final words of this saga, stay with me, because in a moment I'll share the final thought that may just change the way you look at history and at yourself. Because ultimately, the story of Elagabalus isn't just ancient history etched in fading Latin inscriptions or whispered through the corridors of Rome's forgotten palaces. It's a living challenge hurled across the centuries, straight at each of us, daring us to ask whether we too would have the courage to stand before the world, draped in silk and gold, and say, "This is who I am," whether you accept it or not. And perhaps that's why his tale still ignites viral obsessions today under searches like ancient LGBTQ emperors, forbidden Rome, and the transgender rulers who shook the world, because deep down we sense that Elagabalus's tragedy wasn't simply that he was murdered for his audacity, but that he revealed a truth about human nature that still frightens us, that the structures we cling to, the identities we defend, and the gods we worship are all stories we agree to tell ourselves, and the moment someone refuses to play by those rules, the entire illusion begins to tremble. And even in an age of digital freedom, likes and follows can become new prisons if we're too afraid to show who we really are. And so as you stand here in the echo of the Palatine Hill, with Rome's ghosts swirling in the hot Mediterranean breeze, I want you to ask yourself, what would you have done if you'd lived in the time of Elagabalus? Would you have joined the crowds shouting in delight as he shattered boundaries? Or would you have stood in silence, gripping a dagger in the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike him down? Because in the end, his story forces us to admit that history isn't just about emperors and wars. It's about the secret wars waged inside each of us. And as we arrive at the very final words of this saga, stay with me, because in the next breath I'll share a closing thought that might forever change how you see both Elagabalus and yourself. Because here's the truth, shimmering like torchlight on the marble columns of ancient Rome. Elagabalus may have ruled for just 4 fleeting years, but his story endures, because it dares to crack open the deepest vaults of the human soul, demanding that we examine our own boundaries, our own fears, and the masks we wear to hide the parts of ourselves that might scandalize the world. And perhaps that's why even now his name surges through the digital age, driving endless documentaries, passionate debates, and viral searches for ancient transgender rulers, Rome's forbidden emperors, and LGBTQ secrets of history. Because behind the silk gowns and sacred meteorites, behind the rumors of orgies and cosmic marriages, lies a single burning question: how far would you go to live as your truest self, and at what price? And maybe that's why Elagabalus haunts us so fiercely, because in a world that claims to celebrate individuality, yet punishes those who shine too brightly, his life stands as both a warning and an inspiration. A reminder that the human heart yearns to break its chains, even if it risks being cast into the Tiber by those too terrified to imagine a different kind of world. And so, as you close your eyes and let the echoes of flutes and drums fade into the silence of your own thoughts, I invite you to consider this. If you'd been standing in the streets of Rome, watching that golden chariot roll past, would you have turned away in disgust? Or would you have felt a spark of recognition? A whisper that maybe the emperor draped in jewels was not simply mad, but bravely carving a path the world still struggles to follow. And as we approach the very end of this journey together, stay with me, because in the final breath I'll share how Elagabalus's forbidden legacy might hold a key to understanding not only ancient Rome, but the future we're all racing toward. Because in the final glow of this tale, as we stand together on the imagined stones of Rome, listening for the fading footsteps of courtiers in silk and the distant clash of Praetorian swords, one truth pulses like a living star through the centuries: that Elagabalus, the boy who crowned himself a sun god, remains a question more than an answer, a shimmering paradox that refuses to be neatly pinned down in the pages of dusty history books. And perhaps that's why in our modern age, obsessed with identity, authenticity, and the unstoppable churn of viral trends, his name rises again and again in searches for ancient LGBTQ emperors, Rome's forbidden rulers, and the secrets of power and spectacle, because he challenges us to consider whether the true revolution lies not in armies or laws, but in daring to exist as your truest self no matter the cost. And it's precisely this audacity that both fascinates and terrifies us, for in a world built on invisible rules and unspoken boundaries, There is nothing more dangerous or more seductive than someone willing to tear down the walls and declare that the divine might wear pearls, speak with painted lips, and rewrite the rituals of empire. And though his blood was spilled and his name scrubbed from stone, the echo of Elagabalus still vibrates in every debate about freedom, identity, and who deserves a place on history's stage. And so as the final dust of this saga settles, I leave you with this invitation. Carry his story forward. Let it provoke your thoughts, fuel your conversations, and remind you that sometimes the ones we cast as monsters are simply visionaries who dared to dream a world too vast for their own time. And as we approach the last words of our journey, stay with me, because in one final breath, I'll tell you how Elagabalus's blazing legacy might be the secret key to understanding not just ancient Rome, but the viral future unfolding all around us. Because as the final echoes of this tale fade into the Roman twilight, what lingers is the stunning realization that Elagabalus's story has defied every attempt to bury it. Crawling out of rivers' vaults and the silence of erased records to blaze across the screens and search bars of our digital age for, in a world driven by viral curiosity and a hunger for forgotten truths, he has become more than a historical footnote. He's a digital phantom, a figure whose contradictions ignite searches for ancient LGBTQ rulers, forbidden emperors of Rome, and secrets hidden in the shadows of history. And perhaps that's because his life speaks directly to the deepest parts of our modern selves, to the eternal human desire to shape our own identities, to break free from the rigid scripts society tries to impose. And while Rome may have tried to drown him in the Tiber and scrawl him out of memory, the algorithms of our time keep pulling him back into the spotlight, reminding us that stories have a power empires can't extinguish, and that the forbidden, the flamboyant, and the fearlessly true will always find new ways to be seen. And as influencers, creators, and historians breathe fresh life into his legend, Elagabalus becomes a symbol not merely of scandal, but of how the digital age can resurrect voices, once silenced, giving them new platforms to challenge and inspire. And as we stand at this intersection of ancient marble and glowing screens, I invite you to reflect on what other voices history tried to erase, and who among us today might be crafting legends the world will rediscover centuries from now. And as we glide into the closing moments of this journey, stay with me, because in the very last words, I'll share how Elagabalus's blazing ghost might be the ultimate guide for navigating the viral labyrinth of our own times. Because perhaps the final twist in Elagabalus's story, the one that would have astounded even the senators who tried to erase his name, is that the very empire which once condemned him to oblivion has become the perfect stage for his eternal resurrection. Because in our world ruled by algorithms, hashtags, and the relentless pursuit of the next viral spectacle, Elagabalus has found new life as an icon who fascinates precisely because he was forbidden his story blazing through trending searches like ancient LGBTQ rulers, Rome's scandalous emperors, and secrets of imperial decadence. And in a digital age where identity is curated, monetized, and broadcast to billions, his life becomes both a warning and a prophecy, reminding us that the hunger for spectacle and authenticity can elevate a person to godlike heights, even as it sharpens the knives waiting to cut them down. And isn't that the paradox at the heart of our own time, that we worship those who dare to live without masks, only to destroy them the moment they shine too brightly? And so while Elagabalus once rode in a golden chariot pulled by white horses through Rome's gates today, he rides the algorithms appearing in YouTube, thumbnails, viral, TikToks, and late-night debates about power, gender, and the price of selfhood. And maybe that's why his legend still pulses through our screens, because he's a reminder that history's most dangerous figures aren't just those who wage wars, but those who challenge us to see the world and ourselves differently. And as we inch toward the final breath of this journey, stay with me, because in the last words, I'll share why Elagabalus might be the ultimate blueprint for surviving and transforming in an age where going viral is the new path to immortality. Because here's the paradox shimmering like gold dust over Rome's ancient ruins, that while Elagabalus was destroyed for daring to be too different, it's precisely that difference which fuels his immortality today for, in a world forever, scrolling for the next shock, the next forbidden revelation. He has become the ultimate viral story, rising again and again in trending searches for ancient LGBTQ emperors. Rome's hidden scandals, and the wild tales of rulers who blurred the line between human and divine. And maybe that's because deep down we're all haunted by the same hunger that once burned so fiercely in the heart of the teenage son. God, the hunger to shed the masks forced upon us to dance in our own skins without fear, to declare to the world, "This is who I am, and whether you worship me or condemn me, I will not hide." And isn't that the very fuel of modern virality, the reason millions flock to influencers who bare their souls online? Even as the crowd stands ready to crucify those who push too far. Because we love authenticity until it threatens the rules we cling to. And Elagabalus' story, reborn in digital pixels and algorithmic whispers, forces us to confront whether we truly want freedom or whether we merely want a spectacle we can safely watch from behind our screens. And as we prepare to close this journey, stay with me because in the very last breath, I'll share the secret. Elagabalus leaves us a secret that might just hold the key to surviving and thriving in a world where the boundaries between self-story and empire have never been more blurred. So if there's one truth I hope you carry from the blazing saga of Elagabalus, it's this: that history is never really dead, nor are its wildest figures ever truly silent. Because the teenage sun god who once turned Rome into his personal stage still flickers at the edges of our modern world reborn, in viral searches for ancient transgender rulers, forbidden emperors, and the hidden truths of Rome, reminding us that the walls we build around identity, power, and tradition can come crashing down the instant someone dares to live too brightly. And maybe that's why Elagabalus resonates so fiercely today, because in an age of algorithms and endless content, he stands as both a warning and a beacon, showing us that while daring to live, your truth can provoke a world to turn against you. It can also ignite fires that burn long after your name has been scrubbed from stone. And so if this story has captivated you, if it's made you question how thin the line is between genius and madness, between transformation and destruction, then I invite you to keep this conversation alive, like this video, share it with those who love forbidden history and epic tales. Subscribe for more deep dives into the secrets the past tried to bury, and drop me a comment, telling me your thoughts. Do you see Elagabalus as a villain, a visionary, or something in between? Because your voice is part of this story now. And in a world where digital echoes become tomorrow's history, who knows which story we tell next might become the viral spark that changes everything. And until our next journey through the shadows and flames of history, remember, sometimes it's the ones we fear the most who end up shaping the world in ways we can't yet imagine. So maybe as we stand together at the end of this journey through marble halls and blood-stained secrets, the real lesson Elagabalus leaves us isn't just about emperors or scandals or gods carved from black stone. It's about us, about the silent war so many of us fight every day between the person we're expected to be and the person we ache to become. Because deep down, we all carry pieces of the sun God inside us, the desire to shine, to be seen, to step into the light of our own truth, no matter how terrifying that might feel. And here's the secret. Elagabalus whispers across 2,000 years, yes, living your truth might cost you everything, but hiding who you are will cost you your soul. So if this story has stirred something inside you, don't let that spark die. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you believe Elagabalus was a monster, a prophet, or simply a young soul born ahead of his time? Share this video with someone who loves forbidden history and stories that challenge the limits of identity. Hit that like button if you believe that even the strangest tales deserve to be told. And if you crave more journeys into the hidden corners of history, subscribe right now, because together we're going to keep digging up the truths that empires tried to bury. Remember, the stories we choose to tell and the courage to speak them can change not just how we see the past, but how we dare to live the future. Let's keep that fire burning.